Hey guys, Super Nintendo here, and as you know, the Super Nintendo Classic has sold out instantaneously. Basically, it's sold out everywhere, the pre-orders at least. It caught us by surprise again. Best Buy sold out their pre-orders at midnight on Tuesday, and then all the other retailers followed suit in the middle of the day on the next day over, and including GameStop, even with their ridiculous bundles, they were still able to sell out very fast. Even stores reported that about 20 minutes is all it took to sell out of their allotments. So basically that leaves people very frustrated. And of course, the one theory that keeps coming up time and time again anytime that this happens is Nintendo is obviously creating an artificial scarcity, and that's the reason why these things are so hard to find. So let's just look into the history of Nintendo, at least back to the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, since that's kind of where these issues are happening. So let's start out with the NES first. Now the NES came out in 1985. This was 2 years after the video game market crash, so retailers weren't actually very excited to stock a video game system. It seems kind of absurd now, but at the time, Nintendo had to market it as a toy, and as a result, they weren't 100% sure on how well it would actually sell, since the North American market was pretty much dead at that time. So what they did was they did a soft launch in New York, and they sold maybe about 90,000 units in about 9 weeks, which you would think is pretty good, but they really wanted to sell double that. So it didn't do as well as they hoped. They tried different markets. They moved to Chicago, San Francisco, LA, etc., and eventually expanded with the help of World of Wonder. And it's a toy distributor. They're famous for distributing the Teddy Ruxpin and Laser Tag, both of which are very hot items. So retailers were more warm to the idea of stocking a Nintendo when it's backed by such a big toy distributor. So Nintendo, it sold well. There were reports that it had sold out. They kept pushing to meet demand because they couldn't, and in the first year they sold about 1 million units, and they said that they could have sold more if stock would have been better for that. So then you got the Super Nintendo. Now the Super Nintendo seems to be from history's perspective, a slam dunk. Like, Nintendo was thinking ahead and definitely decided to release this thing, but that's not necessarily the case. Nintendo was very comfortable with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was still selling strong, but the Sega Genesis came along and started eating away at Nintendo's market share, offering 16 bits when Nintendo only had 8 bits. So the Super Nintendo comes along. They've been hyping it up in Nintendo Power, which is Nintendo's own, essentially a big advertising avenue for Nintendo. It's positive press. They can release exclusive pictures of their products. They can hype gamers up for it. But parents weren't very happy with it, because that meant that they had to buy a brand new system, because it wasn't compatible with older games, and they would have to buy newer, more expensive games as well. So it kind of makes sense that Nintendo wasn't sure how well the Super Nintendo was going to be. So what they did was they released it in two forms. They released a soft release August 23rd of 1991, and then about 2 weeks later they released a full nationwide release. So during that time, it's a really close up to Christmas, so I couldn't really find too many articles regarding the sellout, but if the past Nintendo system is any indication, it was definitely a hot Christmas item for that year. But also the Game Boy was a very hot item as well. So Nintendo is really smashing it on all fronts. Like, a Nintendo is a Nintendo. They even had to put out that little advertisement that says, hey, it's not a Nintendo, it's a Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo. Nintendo is a brand. So they really wanted to make sure that people knew. So, but regardless, it flew off the shelves. Nintendo had to make sure that they had enough units for everybody to buy, and eventually it became one of the best selling systems for that generation. Which brings us now to the Nintendo 64. Now the Nintendo 64 again made waves. There were plenty of people very excited for this one. It was sold out very fast. It definitely was a hot Christmas item. You saw it featured on Good Morning America. Everybody wanted it because you saw it in the stores and you got to play it, and it was a brand new 3D Mario. So definitely the hype was real for the Nintendo 64, and Nintendo just, again, you can't really keep up a stock of an item that's super hot. You know, even if you're the best manufacturer in the world, you can't necessarily ramp up demand instantaneously. It's gonna be at least a month or two before you can catch up with stock. So the Nintendo 64 sold really, really well. So then you have the PlayStation, Dreamcast, other contenders are starting to come into the market. So you definitely don't have that same appeal that you had with the Nintendo 64, but with the GameCube would see similar results, not as extreme, because you had the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox to compete with, but you will definitely remember the Wii. Now the Wii, when it came out, even though it was a lower power console, it still had motion controls, and you know, that was something that caught everybody off guard. I don't think when it first came out, I remember not too many people were excited for the Wii, especially given the name. It was originally called Project Revolution, and when they came out with the Wii name and it was a white controller with basic buttons, not too many gamers were excited about it. So I think a lot of people just assumed that it wasn't going to sell well. I remember waiting in line at Target with my parents, and we made sure to buy one, but then something really strange happened. It was like a massive success. Nintendo couldn't even keep it in stock regularly for over 2 years. I remember that I had a Wii, you know, since launch. My roommate had borrowed it without telling me, and it freaked me out because if he had lost it, or it got stolen, or it got broken, there was absolutely no way that he was going to be able to pay me back, because you couldn't just go to the store and get them. So, you know, it kind of makes you think in retrospect, you know, yeah, Nintendo had artificial scarcity, but the system was red hot. You know, it's not very often that you see a Nintendo or any other video game system in a nursing home in this generation. I mean, of course, you probably will see Nintendo or any type of game systems in nursing homes when, you know, I'm old, but, you know, seeing my grandma play Wii at the hotel or something like that was definitely interesting, because I knew that she didn't have real and interesting games at the time, but she definitely liked the Wii, where she can slam the paddles over or play bowling or something like that. It was definitely a neat concept that turned a lot of people who don't consider themselves gamers into Wii owners. My dad actually bought 2 systems. He bought one for bowling, and then he never used it, and then I took it, and then he eventually bought one again down the road. So it just goes to show you that Nintendo didn't necessarily expect the Wii to be like this huge deal. And once they did actually get the stock under control, you were able to find them in different areas. They had different colors. They had a miniature one that didn't have internet capability. It was just a small little one that they could sell for $100. It was definitely a good thing that Nintendo had been pushing, so which led people to believe that the next console, which was to be a true HD console, it was powerful enough to handle better games, would be just as big as the success for Wii, and it wasn't. you can chalk it up to bad marketing. Basically, the Wii, when it had the marketing, had a huge push. The whole tagline was "We would like to play." The fact that you can make your own avatar and you know, have it dance and do whatever, that made it look. It definitely was something that people got hooked on. And so when the Wii U came out, a lot of people just thought that it was an add-on for the Wii. And you know, when you have casual people who bought the Wii specifically for Wii bowling, you're not going to get a lot of people who are going to drop $300 or $350 for the 32 gig on another system that doesn't seem to differentiate itself from the Wii. So that's kind of the reason why it didn't sell as well, and you were able to find things on the shelf. It did sell out very early, but eventually Nintendo was able to just keep them on shelves. They came out with different versions. They played around with the price point. I didn't actually buy one until they dropped the price to $299 and they released the Zelda version. So you kind of have to you know, stop and think that, you know, the Wii U is a system that it's not a catastrophic failure, but when you compare it to the Wii, like the success of the Wii, it just doesn't make any sense. So now when you have the Nintendo Switch come out, Nintendo Switch was a gamble. No one really assumed, you know, like leading up to the Switch reveal, people were saying that this is Nintendo's last hurrah. Like, if Nintendo screws this up, that's it for Nintendo. Like, you're gonna have to stick with just the 3DS or something like that, and eventually Mario's gonna be on Xbox or PlayStation, and it's just gonna be the end of Mario as we know it. But, you know, again, the Nintendo Switch is a calculated risk. Basically, I mean, they released the console in March of this year, and they weren't 100% sure on whether or not people would go for a console that is underpowered compared to the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, and that you could also take it on the go, but also play it on your TV. And it turns out that it's actually pretty popular. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Splatoon and ARMS and Mario Odyssey is coming out in 2 months. It's just, Nintendo has gotten it all within their control, except that they can't really keep it in stock. So, I mean, right now, at the recording of this video, I looked online, and online you have all the retailers are sold out. But if you look at the GameStop in-store availability, it's actually across, I took a look, there's maybe about 10 stores within a 30-mile radius of myself that have them in stock still. So, I mean, if you look on GameStop, you'll probably be able to go into the store and buy a non-bundled Switch, which is really good. But now we have to talk about the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic. Now, those are a different story. Basically, Nintendo comes out with this little itty-bitty machine that has a ton of classic games on it for a really, really great price. It's a no-brainer, slam dunk. You would think that Nintendo would make this year-round, but that's not necessarily the case. Nintendo has a... So that's not necessarily the case. Nintendo has... So that's not necessarily the case. Nintendo... So that's not necessarily the case. So you have to understand that Nintendo... So that's not necessarily the case. Nintendo comes out with this NES Classic. They assume that it's just going to be something to tide people over into the Nintendo Switch. People might buy it. I know when the reception had come out beforehand, a lot of fans were like, there's no reason why I would need something like that. I already have all of the games. And then all of a sudden, it sells out super fast. You can't even find them in the stores at all. And then you have people paying 3-4 times what it actually went for in stores, and now suddenly Nintendo has a supply problem. Why didn't Nintendo make enough of these? Well, it's kind of, it's a calculated risk as a business. You can't just assume that if you make 2 million units, you're going to move 2 million units. And if you don't meet that demand, you're going to be catching, if you don't meet that demand, you're going to be playing catch up for the rest of the cycle of this, console's life. And so Nintendo didn't necessarily plan to make these in the long term, so they just discontinued it, which made people even more upset. And so when you can't find something like that, that's when the artificial scarcity comes into play. Nintendo made a deliberate move here to make the NES Classic Edition a limited edition. Now, they didn't say that it was a limited edition right off the bat, but they did say after they discontinued it that the NES Classic was always meant to be a limited edition. So then comes the Super Nintendo Classic. Now, Super Nintendo Classic, it's much more expensive. Well, not actually that expensive more. So then comes the Super Nintendo Classic, and the Super Nintendo Classic is more expensive. It has 10 less games, but it does have Star Fox 2 and an extra controller. So you would think that Nintendo has finally got it under control this time. They said that they're going to make significantly more than the NES Classic. So you kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt, like most Nintendo fans do. But looking at the boondoggle that happened recently with the pre-orders, you kind of have to cast doubt into whether or not Nintendo knows what they're doing. The Super Nintendo Classic and the Nintendo Classic, they sell out really quick because you have an entire untapped base that may not have bought a console since the Super Nintendo, now looking and piquing their interest into these little miniature systems that have a whole bunch of good games all in one little package that they can play on their modern TV, use save states, do rewinds, do all this other interesting things. So Nintendo underestimates the demand for it, and which leaves hardcore Nintendo fans upset because they think that Nintendo is doing this on purpose. And I just don't think that's the case. Nintendo is a household name. Go to anybody off the street who doesn't normally play video games and ask them what the top game for Xbox One is or what PlayStation 4 is. I don't think that they could tell you. But if you ask them who Mario is, I'm pretty sure that they're going to be able to tell you. And so that's kind of what comes into play here. Us Nintendo collectors or Nintendo fanboys or what have you now have to compete for this Super Nintendo Classic with people who wouldn't normally buy a Nintendo Switch. So it doesn't make much sense for people to assume that Nintendo is purposely limiting the stock. Now, Nintendo did say that they're going to make it until 2017 and then that's it. But if you look on eBay right now, you'll see that there are maybe about 500 of these sold, and they're ranging anywhere from $250 to $300. So that's a 3 times pricing difference. So the main theory that I have is that people want this thing because they think it'll be rare. Nintendo has done their part. There's really, all they can do is just sit back and hope that a lot of people who actually want this thing get it, but you can't really fault them too much when you have scalpers who take up all of the stock and then people who actually buy it from the scalpers. It's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. Like, would people pay $240 if they thought that this thing wasn't going to be rare? And would scalpers actually buy this if they didn't think that people would pay you know, that high of a price. It's kind of a weird situation that, you know, creates every time that something very popular that Nintendo makes comes up. You know, Nintendo is a very, like I said, Nintendo is a household name. Anything that has Nintendo is going to sell, and if you make it into something that's a small tiny package with a whole bunch of games on it, people are going to just throw their money at it. So I mean, it just kind of, for me, it's a little bit frustrating to see people say that Nintendo creates this demand on purpose. You know, Nintendo does make quality products, and Nintendo isn't the first company to ever sold out of anything. Sony, Microsoft, they sold out of their Xbox and PlayStations when they first came out as well. They make quality products. Apple sells out of their iPhone for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then eventually they get more in stock. Same thing with Samsung. Google Pixel is another great example. Google has, you know, they came out with this Pixel. This is the first, like, you know, consumer friendly, non-nerdy phone that takes really good pictures. It's a Verizon exclusive, and they just can't keep it in stock. So it just goes to show you that if you make a really good product, it doesn't matter how many items that you put on the shelf, because people will continue to buy it. Now, Nintendo's kind of a special case because of the items that they continually put out onto stock don't stay on the shelves for very long, and so that kind of, you know, gets fans, you know, making this theory which really doesn't have a basis to it. You know, as I explained before, that the reason why they put that artificial scarcity on it, it was because their products weren't proven. The Nintendo Entertainment System was a system that would have failed had it been marketed as a video game system, you know, plain and simple. So it's kind of a testing the waters type of thing. They know that the Super Nintendo Classic is going to sell. They know that the NES Classic is going to sell, but you can only make so many items, and it, you know, right now, items like that, specifically if Nintendo were to pay Foxconn or whoever is manufacturing these things for much more units, how much is that actually going to cost for, you know, the company who's making these? Like, how long is it going to take for their time, and is it going to be profitable? You know, Nintendo probably decides that, hey, like at 3 million units, we're projected to make X amount of dollars off of this 80 MSRP item. If they sell it for any more, would people still buy it? I mean, clearly there's a market for it, but I don't really think that if Nintendo came out and said that this little system with 21 games on it is worth $300, I don't think that people would be clawing at it to pay for it. You know, it's clearly that I gotta have it scenario to it. Nintendo seems to be the masters at creating products that people just want to have. Nintendo, anything that has Nintendo on it, you go into Goodwill, a Nintendo item is going to be 3 times as more expensive than an Xbox item next to the shelf. It's just, that's the way that Nintendo has built their brand over the past 30 years. So that's actually my theory about it. Again, like, I don't think that Nintendo purposely makes these products hard to find. I think that it's a combination of Nintendo making just enough and people just going bonkers because it's Nintendo. Nintendo is a very safe bet when it comes to flipping, and it goes to show you, like, the eBay listings that are selling out just as fast at 3 times the unit, you know, proves that people actually want a Nintendo product that seems kind of rare. So in conclusion, Nintendo, I don't really think that they're limiting stock on purpose to generate hype. One of my case in points is that if you go onto Craigslist right now and you look for a Nintendo Switch, you'd be hard pressed to find one for over $400. You'd probably pay just the amount in tax for the system, and really nothing more to it. It's not, you know, people aren't really in a hurry to pay 3 times as much for a Nintendo console like they were with the Wii. So, but with the Super Nintendo Classic, people know that it's rare, and they're willing to pay 3 times as much to have it because they think that this is going to be their last chance to have it, and it hasn't even released yet. So who knows like what's going to happen, but I again, like, I really don't think that Nintendo is doing this on purpose. The hype behind these machines is incredible, and I don't think that anybody could really predict that people would be climbing over each other to get this seemingly just regular system that probably should just be sitting on the shelves at Walgreens. So I'm curious to hear what you have to think about it. Do you agree with my statements? Did you get a Super Nintendo Classic? I know I didn't, but I'm curious to see if you actually got one and you're planning on keeping it. Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this type of content, I try to post a video once a week. I have a full-time job, so sometimes getting a video out on a consistent basis is kind of tough right now. But I do a video review where I let people choose what video game I should review next. This week's game is Kirby's Adventure, so you should stay tuned for that one. If you like what I do here, please hit the subscribe button. If you like this particular video, hit that thumbs up. I'm Super Nintendo, and I'll see you next time.